Welcome to Sew Very Easy. My name is Laura, and today I'd like to make a clamshell quilt. I love the shape, I love the look, I just love everything about it, except on how much work it can take. So I've come up with a method that uses no templates, there's no hand sewing, there are no special rulers. The only thing we're going to need are charm packs and some stabilizer, so we can print out some shapes to follow along. I promise you, this is going to be a new way to do the clamshell quilt. So I will be using 5-inch pre-cut squares, and I'm going to use 2 charm packs. And this has a beautiful selection of black and soft whites. I will also be adding a solid black and a matching white. Now, of course, you can make as many squares as you want, but this is what I'm going to start with. To make those clamshells from these 5-inch squares, instead of using a template or a ruler, I'm going to cut them out and use some type of a stabilizer. That stabilizer is going to allow us to sew that curve and turn it so it has a nice edge to it. There are many different things that we can use to do this. We can use an interfacing, a stabilizer for embroidery work. I will be using this wash away stabilizer. What I like about this, it does go through the printer, so I'm able to take these sheets and print them right on top of this. This has 2 sides to it. We have a non-glue side and we have a bit of a fusible side. So I will be printing them all out on the side that has the non-stick to it. So I'm just going to be able to put this through the printer and print as many sheets as I want that will match as many squares as I want. When you do go to print out this sheet, you will need to put your printer at 100%. This is a 5-inch square, just without that corner on. Now, if you end up missing some lines with your printer, we're going to be able to just draw them in. You can take a 5-inch square, just match up what lines you see, and just finish drawing them up. Once you have your one sheet done, it should go in the printer with no problems. Once those are all printed out, I'm going to be able to cut them out. So I'm going to take the stabilizer and place it on top of my fabric squares so that the right side and that glue side are touching. I will make sure that all of my fabric is pressed first because I will not be pressing until the very final stage. To sew these, we just need to match up those corners. You can see where we're going to be able to just put that needle and stitch all the way around and come back off. For the stitching, I would recommend to take the stitches and make them a little bit smaller at about a 2. A smaller stitch helps turn curves and it's going to make it stronger. Once I have all of my pieces stitched together, I'm going to cut off this point. We can use a regular pair of scissors to trim this out, but I do like to use pinking shears. And that's just going to sort of make that fabric a lot softer when we turn it right side out. So I'm going to trim close to the stitching line, but not too close that it's going to come apart. And I definitely am not going to hit that stitching line. I do not want to cut it. Once that's trimmed off, I could just take this and turn it right side out. The stabilizer is going to make it keep the shape, and I don't have to do any pressing. That's why it's important that the fabric is well pressed before. So I'm just going to make sure that that is all flat, and I just press it with my hand. And you can see how nice that shape is. And I still don't need to do any pressing, but I do have that little bit of an adhesive on this side. The other thing that I like about this particular stabilizer, it is considered a wash away. So after the quilt is washed, a lot of this is going to wash away. You're going to have a very, very soft piece inside. I now have all of my clamshells or my little ice cream cone shapes already done and cut out. From here, we're going to quilt and put this together all at the same time. So when we're done, the quilt will actually be quilted. We need to start with our batting, and we're going to have that back fabric on our batting. So whatever your favorite method is, make sure that those two layers are sandwiched together. From there, the top of the batting, we need to have a 4-inch strip of fabric. And it's important that this strip of fabric is straight because this is going to start us off as we go forward. So I have my backing, my batting together, and just one 4-inch strip. From there, I'm going to divide it into 5-inch segments. I like to start so that that 5-inch is in the center. So this would be the center of my batting. You're going to be able to determine the size depending on how many pieces of those clamshells you're going to make. And as we go along, you're going to be able to see that, and you'll be able to determine how many you would like to do. So we're going to start with this 4-inch strip. I have put it on, and I have my marks. The fun part is these little ice cream cones are going to fit in between these 5-inch marks. When we look at this ice cream shape, we're going to notice that we have the round top and the sides come a little bit straight and then they stop and come to a point. These two areas where we have the point are going to go along the bottom of that fabric. And that straight edge is going to go right along those marks. So that's where the first piece is going to go. I'm going to do the second, and you can see that these edges are going to match up. So I have all of those points that line right up. Because this is fusible, I'm going to be able to fuse this down. But before I fuse it down, I do want to make sure and just do a double check that this point is straight. Once we line it up once, the rest are going to go together really well. So I have a line that lines up along that top, and I do want that point to come straight. And this I'm going to do right at the iron. So at the iron, I'm going to match that center piece, line up that point, and press that on. Line up the second piece, check and make sure that my point is on point, and press. I have 7 clamshells laid out, and because this is 5 inches, I do have a 35-inch piece. I did pin the points and just put a little pin up at the top. Even though this is fused on, I will be bringing this to the machine and stitching around all of these, and the pin's just going to hold them just for extra security. So now it's very simply to go to the machine, and I'm going to applique all the way around, non-stop, from one edge to another. Now, if you like to hand applique, this is definitely a good project to do that. But I will go to my Bernina and do the sewing. So let's go to the machine and I'll show you my setup. So the stitch I'm going to use, it goes a little bit straight, then a zigzag, a little bit of straight, and then a zigzag. You can do a zigzag stitch or even just a straight stitch. So in my case, it's stitch 1331, and I've adjusted this to be a nice small stitch, and I do have foot 20C on. The 20C is an open embroidery foot, so it has this big opening here. I'm going to have the fabric go along the one edge, and it's going to stitch and stitch over. So I'm going to put that right against the edge. So the higher part of that clamshell will fit right along the edge. So I'm going to stitch with that little zigzag coming in. And I'm going to follow that edge. So I've moved my needle all the way over. So when you look along the edge, the stitching is in the background and that little zig point is coming into the fabric. So I'm just going to continue to follow this edge. And I'm going to go all the way around all of the clamshells. And I'm just using the edge of the foot as the guide, so I've moved my needle over. So I'm making this quilt and quilting the quilt all at the same time. You can see those little stitches, a couple of stitches and then a little zigzag in. So I've gone down and back up. So that first row is all stitched on. Now we're going to iron on the second row. So when that first row was stitched, I did not stitch those points down. Now I'm going to add my second row. My second row is going to go in between. And we're going to use those little ends, just like we matched to that row. This time, they're going to match to the points. So if you look underneath, you will see that fusible stops and makes a point. It's that point that's going to go from point to point. This point is going to line up now with that center line. So I can just take a straight ruler, match up that first line that I drew, and just make sure the point is, well, in line. So each of those corners will match the previous point. I will have 7 for the one row, but this row I will only have 6. So we're going to have a piece off on both sides. When we are pressing these on, try to keep the iron onto the fabric and not onto the batting. I'm going to now take this back to the machine and I'm going to stitch the same as I did this first row. Go all the way around each one of those clamshells. So we're not stitching these points down. That second row is done. I do leave my quilt batting rolled up, so I'm only working on one section at a time. The next row, it's going to be the same thing. Those little edges are going to match the points. You'll find after a while you won't really need the ruler. You're just going to be able to see where that lines up. So I'm going to iron all of those on and stitch them. So you're just going to be able to keep going row by row by row. As we look at this quilt, we will notice that every other row will have some quilt batting that is exposed. Those rows, we're going to have a portion of that shell cut off. It's not half a shell, so we can't cut that shell in half and put the other half to the other side. It's a half plus a 1/4 inch. So keep that in mind when you are using those squares. The top, we're going to leave a 1/4 inch seam allowance for our binding, but this extra will also be cut off. So let's get all of the rows done, and you're going to see that this does go together quite quickly. The body of the quilt is now done. We have 7 rows of the white shells and 7 rows of the dark shells. The light shells did have 7 shells in them, and the dark ones did have 6 shells in them. So we're going to have approximately 35 inches of length for the quilt. We will now need to trim this quilt down and take off all the extra. And for the bottom, we did trim off enough that we are going to be able to do a 1/4 inch. So we don't want to trim it up here. We want to trim it as close as we can to this bottom. When we are trimming the sides, be sure to leave a 1/4 inch seam allowance along that edge. So we've trimmed off almost half of that shell. And for the top, just trim off so that we have a 1/4 inch right along the top. So we're going to have a 1/4 inch all the way around all of the sides. And from here, we are going to be able to add our binding on. The quilt went together really quick and easy. And I did use a backing fabric that was rather busy. So you really don't see the stitching at all, but it's already quilted and 100% done. This was a put it together, quilted, and get it all done at the same time of a quilt. Now that little binding did cut off half of those clamshells on the sides and on the bottom. Now we could have repeated the same thing up at the top. So the clamshells would have been cut right here, and that would have been more of the traditional style. But I don't mind that little black at the top. We do need to cut out some type of a stabilizer, but then after that we just put it on, cut, we don't have to think about anything, trim it, turn it, stick it on the quilt and go. Now if you use a stabilizer that does not have a fusible on it, you can just use a glue stick or any type of a glue that's going to wash out just to hold that on as you go stitching around. I've always loved the look and the shape of the clamshell, but I didn't always like the work. So this definitely speeds up that process. Thank you for joining me today on Sew Very Easy. Feel free to subscribe. I'm on Facebook, Instagram. I have a newsletter. It's all free under Sew Very Easy. Thanks again for joining me. Bye for now.